Hi, welcome to the second of our mini lectures for EDF5641. This week we're talking about how languages are learned. So we're going to talk a little bit about not only the theories that are related to second language acquisition, but also how this kind of connects to learning in general, whether it's a first language or so on. So how do we acquire language? So I think it's first really helpful to think about how do we learn language, whether it's our first or second or third language. So what do we know about how we ourselves or how little children learn language? So we're talking about what we call the mother tongue or the first language or the home language. So at what age does one start learning language? And I guess if we reflect on this, we might think about babies make sounds and they start kind of forming sounds from very early on, and they're playing with it. They're playing with the sounds, they're listening, they're playing, but there's a lot of observation. How long does it take before they start talking? Well, I think a lot of children start kind of saying first words just before 2, or 1, and then at 2 they're talking a bit more. But again, this is really developmental, and it really depends on the child and on a whole bunch of factors. But it's interesting because I think what we don't ask is when is a person proficient in their mother tongue or their first language? That's a hard question to ask, because are they proficient? Because we often think of English as an additional language in terms of reading, speaking, listening, and writing. But most children don't learn to read until their first year of formal schooling, and even that is, they're developing it over time. So hard to say, and also depends on the child, because there's obviously a lot of diversity in classrooms, even with students that we would say are native speakers of a particular language. So interesting that we often, particularly here in Australia, I was in a conference listening to a study, and they were talking about how long does it take a student to learn a language, to acquire a language. And they have this idea that it takes 5 to 7 years, but I find it really interesting to say that it takes this many years. And the way that funding works here in Australia is that usually you have 5 years of funding where you're considered EAL, and then it's by then you should have grasped it. So it's just interesting that we often put a time on learning a second language, but it's a little bit varied in our first or our mother tongue. We talk about what is usually learned first. So do we comprehend? Do we hear words first? Do we speak first? Obviously, kind of listening, speaking kind of develop first, and then reading and writing. And so, when we think about learning theories in just the notions of language acquisition in general, we often think of things like behaviorism, where if if children hear things and they copy and they imitate and they are positively reinforced, then they will continue to do those things. Then we have the side of Vygotsky, Lev Vygotsky, and other theorists like Piaget that had these more cognitive and more social theories of learning. So the idea that we learn by interaction, and so on. So these are all kind of learning theories that support the idea of how we develop language, particularly things like Vygotsky that says, language is this tool and we interact and we negotiate meaning, which is very much echoed within how we talk about second language acquisition. So if we think about that as a first language or a home language or mother tongue, however we want to describe it, how does that compare with second language acquisition? And in many ways, there are a lot of similarities. And I think we can learn from how children and how people learn a first language to how they learn a second language. But of course, there are different things. And I think one of the things that is different is the time frame. Cognitively, developmentally, as a baby, there's a limit to how much they can actually take in and produce. So, and one of the arguments later on that we'll discuss is that often people say, oh, children, that's the best, children, they can learn languages really easily. And there's a lot of researchers that argue, yes, but to a certain point, they can kind of take it naturalistically and they can gain understanding of the language, but at some point, cognitively, they need more to help stimulate their kind of mental processing. So, these are all things that we're going to slightly talk about. But I think the interesting thing about second language acquisition is that there's a lot of theories, and they're theories. So, if there was just one way and we said, this is how it is, that's fantastic. But there's a lot of discussion, and I don't think it's one way or the other. But I think we learn from these theories to kind of form ideas about how we look at our teaching, and knowing that there are a lot of theories, and I think there are some truths about these theories, but we take as much as we can from all of them, instead of just saying, well, this is the way it is, and that's, we're not going to acknowledge anything else. But we can learn from all of these different theories. So we have this idea of naturalistic versus form-focused instruction. And that's kind of, and often in education, I think, we talk about the pendulum swings. And, at one time it was like, we need to teach phonics. And then, no, we don't teach phonics. Oh, we need to specifically teach grammar. No, we don't teach grammar. And sometimes, most of the time, I think there is a balance between the two. But one of the things in second language acquisition is there's always been this kind of discussion between, do we focus on, do we let language learners just kind of immerse themselves in the language and just pick it up as they go in a very natural way, or implicitly, or do we explicitly teach and instruct them in language? So that's kind of the difference between what we talk about meaning and versus form. So do we just let it happen naturally, or do we actually teach specifically things like grammar and so on to help them understand the language more specifically? So here's just kind of a little bit, and this is, again, you can read all this, but this is kind of reiterating some of these ideas. Hopefully will help you kind of process them. So Chomsky talks about language. It's not about, language isn't acquired by just repetition, but through mental processing. Okay, now this is really interesting because obviously they're in just language learning, learning in general, not just specifically on language. There's a lot that's discussed about information processing model or behaviors, and the idea that, our brains are like a computer, and information or input goes in, and it's cognitively, it's mentally processed, and that's how we learn. And Chomsky has kind of that similar idea that we have this mental processing, in our brains, and in our kind of computer system in our head, there we have a program which is universal grammar. And so if we put enough input in there, that universal grammar will help kind of sort things out. And, I guess against behaviorism would say, let's do more repetition. But this idea of mental processing is like, well, let's, our brains are set up cognitively, you just have to put the right input in. Now, Krashen kind of goes along those same lines, and he says, like, it's not about, we can basically acquire language subconsciously if we're given enough and the right input. So his idea was the input hypothesis, and he talks about this idea of comprehensible input, and that's an important word, comprehensible, saying like this is input that it's, and somewhat meaningful. So I plus one. So it's saying we have to pitch the input based on the information students have plus one. So don't make it too much so that they can actually grasp it. And this, interestingly, very much links to the idea of Vygotsky's zone of proximal development that talks about, we learn, there's a kind of a zone where there's things that students or language learners can do, or just learners in general can do on their own. And then it's the next step up, things that they need a bit of help with. So whether it's a teacher or a peer, that's where the learning happens. It can't be too challenging, but it's just like one step up, one little bit where they just need a bit of help, a little bit of guidance to do it, where they couldn't do it on their own, but with a little bit of help they could. And that's where the learning happens. So that's what Krashen's talking about. But still, it's this really idea that, he felt that, we learn things subconsciously, and if we just have the right input, it's fine. And he was really kind of against this idea of explicit instruction. And he talked about there was the roughly tuned input, which is the idea that it's just input coming in, and there's a finely tuned input. And he felt that if you have both the roughly or just the naturalistic thing and the finely tuned input, it doesn't actually aid acquisition. So he's saying that they have to learn kind of a naturalistic way because this explicit instruction isn't helping. Now you read in your textbook by Harmer a little bit about like a study, I think it was in Saudi Arabia, that talks about how they found actually there's a limit to where students need more explicit instruction to help them kind of improve. So there's only a certain point they can kind of learn the language, and then they, from then on, need more explicit instruction. So Nina Spada is one of the researchers that really talks about this idea of guided instruction and explicit instruction, form-focused instruction. So her and Patsy Lightbrow talk about that the naturalistic approach only works with young children and only to a particular point. Even with young children, it gets to a point where there's at some point they need more explicit instruction. Now, in one of the papers, they talk about form-focused instruction, and they say that it's really important for furthering language learning. And there's the idea of isolated, which is that, the instruction is an isolated activity. It's just an activity on its own. And then there's integrated, so that this instruction is very much seamlessly integrated in the context of a communicative classroom. Now, communicative classroom is the idea that there's a real focus on interaction, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But because often we think of communicative as being communication, as in speaking, working in pairs and groups and so on. But there can be a bit more to just the idea of speaking and listening in a communicative classroom. And they also talk about comprehensible input, this idea of crash-ins, but the comprehensible input needs to include instruction and specific feedback to students. So instead of not giving specific feedback to students, we have to give feedback to students, and that's how they learn. We have to give specific and explicit instruction for them to learn. That's how they kind of code that input. Schmidt also talked about noticing. So the idea that students need to be guided in their instruction, so to draw attention to particular language structures and forms. For example, my oldest child is 7, and he is learning to read. And one of the things that we do when we read is there'll be we're like thought, for example, and it's going O-U-G-H-T, and going, what other words have that, and having that sound and placing it with others and seeing patterns. Those things are kind of drawing attention to those particular structures and forms, which he can then later hold on to as, oh, I remember there was something about that particular form and structure that they can then apply later. One of the things in my classroom that I might do is there would be a sentence or there would be something, and I go, oh, this is a very interesting sentence. What is the author trying to do? Or what kind of verb tense? And it's just taking opportunities, and it can be very natural opportunities to say, oh, that was an interesting thing you said. Why did you use that word? And what meaning does that word convey? So really being able to just, in a very natural way, notice and draw attention to particular structures and forms. And saying, why do we say it this way and why we don't? But in a very meaningful way. So one of the things that Schmidt also talks about is that things need to be meaningful for students. So sometimes they can look at something and it means nothing to them, but when they're almost ready for it, or when it's prominent enough or noticeable enough to them, then they'll take notice of it because it's meaningful for them. So finding ways to make things meaningful, I think students notice much more about the language, but you have to make it meaningful. And that's something that we I think always go on about language, is that if it's not meaningful, and this is not just language, but in general, if it's not meaningful for students, they don't tend to really engage with this much. So if we can really draw attention, make it meaningful, students start to kind of notice these language structures and forms a bit more. Now, here's just a few more kind of comments I wanted to make. So I think particularly here in Australia, one of the things that we find is that there's kind of two aspects of English as an additional language. You have the interpersonal and social skills that you need. So, basic things, like I say basic needs cards. Sometimes there are students that come in, they have just recently arrived, and they have very, very little English. Now, one of the things that we have to really consider is their basic needs. So can they actually communicate their basic needs if they have no other way to communicate those? So sometimes with students like that, I'll have these basic needs cards, like, you know, it could be like a question card or things like that that they can put on the table if they need to communicate but they don't have the words. Because those, before anything else, students need to be able to communicate their basic needs, especially if they're in a context where nobody speaks their language. It's really important. But I think sometimes using like little cards that everyone has, they have them on their desk, allows students to communicate those basic needs. So there's that side of things. And sometimes EAL students focus so much on the interpersonal and social, but they kind of forget about the academic language. And I think for many students, we have to focus on both, the interpersonal and social versus the academic. And of course, if the focus of the class is on just one specifically, you would do that. But we need to find a balance between both. For example, encouraging academic texts and exposing to different genres. What does a narrative story look like? A story look like compared to a recipe? Looking to see that there are different types of genres and texts in English. Or other tensions. Harmer talks about form versus forms. So the form is really what Spada and Light Brown talk about in regards to, you know, focus on explicit instruction or guided instruction, but this can happen at any point in a lesson. So, you know, you might have students kind of do a task and, you know, task-based learning approach, they do a task, and then you talk about and you notice the things, the structures and so on after. And you know, or you can do it before, you do a little bit of that, but that's the thing about form, is there's a focus on form, but it can be any time in the lesson. Where forms is really that everything is structured around, you know, maybe a grammatical sequence, okay? And I think there's quite a bit of research to talk about that, you know, is there an actual sequence? I think there are some things that students learn or have to use more early on, but very difficult to say that there's actually a grammatical sequence that you should learn it in this particular way. But interestingly, with that said, most textbooks, many textbooks for English language are based around structures and forms, and it's organized by learning different forms. Now, of course, there's new ways of looking at that, particularly about functional language. So let's focus about, you know, how do we greet? How do we persuade? How do we do these things? So sometimes now things are being structured around functions. So there's a variety of ways that people structure how they present the language. Another tension that continues to be there is that idea of accuracy versus fluency. Are we focusing on accuracy or are we focusing on fluency? Do we want the students to just be able to speak or write fluently but make a lot of mistakes, or is it about being accurate? And I think it's finding a balance between that. The other point I wanted to make was that, you know, sometimes we expect that things happen in this developmental sequence, but sometimes it goes a way that, you know, you wouldn't expect. So even with my own children learning in their first language, I noticed with my children, they've done something like this where, you know, they say, I eat the food last night, okay? And of course, as a teacher, as a parent, I said, oh, you ate that, did you? And then over time, then they start saying, oh, I ate it. And then this interesting thing happens is that they become more aware of language, and they realize that when a word ends with ed, it's a past tense. So then my child who used to say, I ate my dinner, said, I ate it, because they're actually, you know, and they're actually progressing in their understanding because they're actually taking notice of these rules and they're trying to apply them, even though it wasn't, you know, in this circumstance, they don't need to add an ed. So, but this shows that they are developing, even though they went from being correct to actually saying it incorrectly. So I think that's what it's important to think about with accuracy. Sometimes they explore more with different structures, which is fantastic, but they may not be accurate. But it doesn't mean that they're kind of, you know, not doing as well. They're actually progressing in their understanding, but they're sorting through some of those things. We'll talk more about this later, but when we talk about learning a language, we often talk about communicative competence. And this was a lot of the work with Canali and Swain, or Canali in 1983. But they look at kind of these four different parts of what does it mean to be communicatively competent. and that is an understanding of the grammatical, so the words and the rules, the sociolinguistic, so the appropriateness of the words that you use, discourse, so are you able to use the language in a cohesive and coherent way? Does it make sense? Does it follow an order? Is it logical? And then strategic. Can they use appropriate use of strategy? So for example, if you're having a conversation and the conversation breaks down, what strategies do you use to start it up again? How do you self-correct? These sorts of things. So we'll talk more about this, but they give this kind of model for the idea of this is what it means to be communicatively competent, and this is really what language consists of. It consists of the words and the rules. It consists of being able to use the language appropriately in certain circumstances and contexts. It also is able to use language in a coherent and cohesive way, so being able to put it in a structure. And finally, to use it strategically, so using a range of strategies to interact. One of the other questions is, do we provide a lot of routine and habit forming drilling exercises, or do we have interaction? So I find this really interesting because, again, I have young children. So there was the Ni Hao Kai Lan and then Dora the Explorer. And if you look at these shows, which is highly popular with children, what are they using? Are they using the ideas of repetition or interaction? Well, they use a little bit of both. They, often will say something and they'll go, "What do you think?" And they ask you to say it. But if you see, they'll say, "Let's say together, do this," and then everybody's supposed to say it together. They're using that drilling method in a very, very popular and current child cartoon. So I think that's interesting to see that actually repetition can be used in a very positive way as well. I know that my children can speak a little bit of Spanish just because of Dora. So the idea that language comes from forming habits through repetition or behaviorism. So I think one of the interesting things about repetition is that, behaviorism has this idea that you have a stimulus and then you respond to that stimulus, and then, if there's positive reinforcement, then you'll do it again and again. Now, I think that repetition can have a very, powerful role. I know even for me when I started my doctorate that I would do things like I had a vocabulary notebook that had a lot of very research-specific terminology, and I would go through it, especially at nighttime, and I just kind of go through and repeat it. We have things like spelling tests or so on. These things kind of require repetition and reviewing them and so on, so sometimes it can be helpful. I think often we think about the idea of drilling versus communicative language approach. So the ideas that we learn through communication and interaction, we see these as being two very different approaches. So the communicative language approach is very much about these social learning theories that we learn by interaction, we learn by negotiating meaning. So if we think about this idea of input, communication requires more than just processing input. So it's not like we're just passively listening to things, but communication is a two-way street. So what we have to do is it requires some cognitive, obviously we're processing, but there's some cognitive learning because we have to negotiate meaning. We have to, there are times when you say something and the other person doesn't understand what you're saying, and then you have to find ways to come together to understand what you're saying. And that's where the negotiating meaning, and that's where the cognitive understanding comes. So in a lot of ways, it's more than just processing input. There's a really powerful learning opportunity in negotiating meaning between other people. Here's some just practical applications from my own research. My doctoral studies looked at the TOEFL IBT, particularly in Vietnam, and looked at the influence it had on both teaching and learning. And one of the things that I think is important is looking at communicative language teaching, but there's this idea that there's a weak and a strong version. So the weak version is what we primarily think of, which is the idea that communicative language teaching is about providing lots of group and pair work, and that we have lots of interaction and spoken communication, so speaking, listening. Where actually communicative language teaching is not just about speaking and listening, it's about this idea of interaction, but that you interact with text. You interact and you have a very active role in how your reading and your written work. And so it's very meaningful and it's very interactive individual work with text. And I think it's an important thing, is that communicative language teaching is not just about speaking and listening all the time. We use a range of ways to approach learning, so even repetition, to reach a range of different student learning preferences and contexts. And I think this is really important, is that sometimes we come in and we have different models. So we say, well, we do communicative language teaching here, but that might not work with all students. Some people don't really like working in groups. And it's okay to use that approach, but I think you have to find a balance between things. I think having one idea and going, we just focus on groups all the time and so on, but then sometimes we translate and we find ways to kind of really interrogate and explore and unpack texts. I think that there's a balance, and then there's time for instruction, sometimes where you listen. So, I think that there's a bit of balance there. So as I mentioned here, I think we focus on the implicit, so we allow students to discover and manipulate the language on their own, but we also support that with explicit instruction and feedback. And the other thing I think from my own research that I found is that a student's first language is a very powerful resource, just like spoken language is for written language. And I'll give that example. And this is again from my own children, is that when they're reading, they're trying to read a word, they're trying to sound out a word, and then they say it and they go, oh, because they know the word. They orally know the word because they understand the word because they use it in their everyday speech. But they haven't made the connection between the word that they know and that they can speak, between the written word, so the sound, and the written word. So when children are learning their first language, often the spoken language is a resource for them to identify words in the written language. And this is similar to those who are learning another language, is that their first language is a resource. And I think that's really important, because sometimes we worry that there's too much interference of a first language. And while there can be some language transfer, so you might not have a particular sound in your language and that becomes very difficult, or you pronounce certain things a certain way, it's actually more of a resource than it is interference. Now for this week, just make sure you read your assigned reading and familiar yourself with the lesson plan format. I'm going to give a special kind of video about assessment task 1 to kind of walk you through it. But I want you to start thinking about what kind of curriculum framework you want to use. You are more than welcome to use, a Victorian framework, whether that's the new EAL curriculum, or if that is the EAL continuum, you can use that, or you can use a curriculum framework from your home country if you're from another country. But do just double check that with your tutor to make sure that it is suitable. I also want to make a note here that in the lesson plan, you're not taking resources from textbooks or online. This is something, you can obviously adapt things, but this is something that needs to be original. And so really think about, who are your students, what do you want them to learn, and then go from there. Instead of going, oh, here's something in a textbook, how do I, use that? So start with the students first in the context, and then develop a lesson based on that. And then complete the online activities for week 3. Have a lovely week, and thanks for listening.